The code compiled successfully, but no one stopped to ask what happens when it runs. An algorithm returns an output, and someone says it made a choice, grasped meaning, preferred or desired something. The grammar quietly changes the moral story. The anthropomorphism trap begins when convenient language assigns human-like agency to a mechanism. The shortcut may help conversation while obscuring who actually set the objective and consequences. That boundary remains connected to consequences. The issue is not vocabulary policing, it is responsibility. When a system sounds like an independent actor, human choices can fade into the background. That contrast remains bounded by purpose. A phrase such as "the system made the choice" compresses design, training, deployment, interpretation, and institutional policy into one apparently self-contained agent. That asymmetry remains linked to authority when the result begins to shape opportunity. This episode asks why that compression matters even when many listeners understand that the phrase is partly metaphorical. That handoff remains important to affected people where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. To answer, we must distinguish functional description, conversational shorthand, psychological projection, moral agency, and legal or institutional accountability. That condition remains limited by practical conditions while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. Suppose a ranking output removes an application from consideration. Saying the system rejected the person makes the outcome sound self-originating. That choice remains worthy of explicit scrutiny before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. A more precise description asks who defined the criteria, approved the use, interpreted the output, and determined that removal would follow. That tension remains open to review once the process carries practical consequences. Now, precision does not require awkward technical language in each sentence. It requires language that keeps the relevant responsibility chain visible. That limitation remains subject to justification without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. Anthropomorphic terms can be harmless when used as shorthand and dangerous when they become explanations. The difference depends on what the language hides. That priority remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. To learn, decide, understand, or want are ordinary human concepts carrying assumptions about intention, awareness, reasons, and accountability. That relationship remains part of the design rather than disappearing behind the output. Applied to machines, those terms may refer only to pattern adjustment, output selection, state change, or optimization under supplied rules. That safeguard remains inseparable from institutional choice as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. The distinction matters. Similar verbs can describe very different underlying capacities. Shared grammar does not prove shared agency. That responsibility remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. Moral agency usually involves more than producing an outcome. It concerns reasons, understanding, choice, responsiveness to moral claims, and the capacity to bear responsibility. That agency remains central to the moral inquiry. A technical system may influence action without meeting those conditions. Influence alone does not settle whether the system deserves praise, blame, rights, or punishment. That authority remains within human responsibility. Anthropomorphism becomes ethically important when people use agency language to redirect accountability away from designers, institutions, or operators. That consent remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. It can also work in the opposite direction. Human-like framing may encourage trust, sympathy, fear, or obedience beyond what the system's actual function justifies. That fairness remains dependent on context. We built the mirror. The language may reflect our own habits of social interpretation more than any inner life within the machine. That justification remains unsettled by technical performance once the process carries practical consequences. A further distinction separates uncertainty from evidence. Not knowing the full internal state of a system does not authorize confident claims that it understands or lacks relevant capacities. That oversight remains necessary for accountable judgment. Pause and examine the trade-off. Shorthand can make complex technology understandable, yet excessive shorthand can replace explanation with a fictional character. that contestability remains tied to real burdens, especially where affected people cannot easily object. The core mechanism begins with grammatical agency. Sentences require subjects, and the system's name often becomes the easiest subject for describing a distributed process. That purpose remains ethically relevant rather than disappearing behind the output. Once the system occupies that grammatical position, verbs associated with intention follow naturally. Repetition then makes the metaphor feel literal. That burden remains connected to consequences as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. Next comes causal compression. Many human and institutional decisions disappear into a single phrase, reducing a responsibility network to one apparent actor. That trade-off remains bounded by purpose, because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. That compression changes what questions people ask. Instead of examining objectives and authority, they may speculate about what the machine wanted. That assumption remains linked to authority when the result begins to shape opportunity. The shift is subtle but consequential. A poorly framed question can direct attention away from the people capable of changing the process. That decision remains important to affected people, where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. Then comes moral displacement. Praise or blame attaches to the system, while those who approve the design can present themselves as passive observers. That framework remains limited by practical conditions. We are still responsible. A mechanism cannot become the convenient endpoint of accountability merely because its internal operation is complex. That constraint remains worthy of explicit scrutiny before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. Anthropomorphic language can also intensify technological determinism. If a system appears to possess its own will, its outcomes may seem self-directing rather than governed. That incentive remains open to review. That impression can weaken democratic, organizational, or personal scrutiny by making human intervention appear less relevant than it actually is. That interpretation remains subject to justification without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. Another effect concerns consent. People may interact differently when a system is presented as caring, understanding, or personally attentive. That allocation remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. Those impressions can matter even when no explicit claim of consciousness is made. Interface tone and conversational language may still invite social assumptions. That process remains part of the design. Observed fluency is not identical to understanding. A coherent response can be evaluated for usefulness without treating coherence as proof of inner experience. That metric remains inseparable from institutional choice. Likewise, error does not prove the absence of agency, just as successful output does not prove its presence. The philosophical question requires separate argument. That objective remains open to revision. Technical success is not moral permission. Performance alone cannot settle whether anthropomorphic framing is truthful, fair, or appropriate for the context. That exception remains central to the moral inquiry when the result begins to shape opportunity. A better vocabulary describes operations and decisions at the right level. The system generated, ranked, matched, filtered, or produced an output under specified conditions. That uncertainty remains within human responsibility. A reasonable counterpoint is that perfectly literal language can become unreadable. Everyday communication depends on metaphors, abbreviations, and personification. That benefit remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. That is true. The ethical goal is not to eliminate each metaphor, but to prevent metaphor from carrying unsupported conclusions about agency or responsibility. That risk remains dependent on context. Another counterpoint is that human agency itself is philosophically contested. There is no simple, widely accepted checklist for intention, consciousness, or moral responsibility. That permission remains unsettled by technical performance. Of course, that uncertainty should make claims more careful, not less. It supports distinguishing observed function from interpretation. That review remains necessary for accountable judgment without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. A legitimate use of anthropomorphic language appears in clearly marked analogy, education, or interface design when the audience is unlikely to mistake shorthand for moral fact. that appeal remains tied to real burdens. Even then, the context should preserve an accurate route back to the human choices and technical limits behind the metaphor. That governance remains ethically relevant rather than disappearing behind the output. A limitation is that language cannot remain perfectly neutral. A description emphasizes some features and leaves others less visible. That accountability remains connected to consequences as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. The opening question can now be answered. It matters whether we say a system decided because the phrase can relocate agency, authority, and blame. That autonomy remains bounded by purpose. Precise language does not solve the ethical problem, but it helps identify who can explain, contest, and change the decision. That dignity remains linked to authority when the result begins to shape opportunity. The machine may produce the output, the institution determines its role, the developer may set constraints, leadership determines where the system receives authority. That power remains important to affected people. Operators interpret recommendations, and affected people experience consequences. A complete description should keep those relationships visible. That context remains limited by practical conditions, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. The important distinction is between technical success and ethical justification. Functional capability does not automatically create moral status or excuse human governance. That deployment remains worthy of explicit scrutiny before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. And yet, precision should remain proportional. A casual metaphor may be acceptable where stakes are low and responsibility is already clear. That evaluation remains open to review once the process carries practical consequences. In higher stakes settings, language should identify the action more carefully because ambiguity can shape trust, consent, review, and accountability. That consequence remains subject to justification without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. A useful practice is to replace intentional verbs with operational verbs whenever responsibility could otherwise become unclear. That standard remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. Another practice is to name the human decision surrounding the output, who selected the objective, authorized deployment, and attached the consequence. That criterion remains part of the design, rather than disappearing behind the output. Ask what the anthropomorphic phrase invites the listener to assume. Does it imply understanding, preference, neutrality, inevitability, or independent authority? That threshold remains inseparable from institutional choice, as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. Then test whether those assumptions are supported by the described function or merely imported from ordinary social language. That distribution remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. Examine who benefits when the system appears agentic. Human actors may gain distance from responsibility, while users may be encouraged to trust or comply. That procedure remains central to the moral inquiry. Compare the description under responsibility, dignity, consent, and uncertainty frameworks. Each reveals a different risk created by careless personification. That capacity remains within human responsibility, where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. Preserve uncertainty honestly. Avoid declaring either consciousness or complete moral emptiness when the argument has not established either conclusion. That role remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. Finally, return each important outcome to a responsibility chain. Identify who could have chosen differently and who can still revise the process. That transfer remains dependent on context before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. Not can we, but should we. The most responsible language makes technology understandable without turning a designed mechanism into a fictional moral agent. That result remains unsettled by technical performance.